It's been reported in the media, including the Wall Street Journal, in the last week or so, that a European intelligence agency has developed a strategy which has been dubbed a financial nuclear bomb, obviously financial, figuratively speaking, to undermine the Trump administration in the next midterm elections, which come up around this time next year. So it should be in November 2026. What does all this say about the current state of the transatlantic relationship and the trajectory of the Russo-Ukrainian war? Privyt, my name is Connor Klein. I'm back inside again because it is super cold in Odessa, Mama, here in the shores of the Black Sea. I have a background in international relations, have been living on and off in Ukraine for over a decade, and I used to actually work at the EU institutions as a lawyer. So I can give you a more unique and nuanced insight into what's happening here. And we're going to look at how economics can influence onto geopolitics and then onto the actual fighting here on the front lines in Ukraine. So collectively, the European Union countries plus United Kingdom own about $2.34 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds. And these reports say that a European intelligence agency, it doesn't say which European country's intelligence agency have developed this strategy, but apparently it was leaked to the media, if it's to be believed. And they see that as a weakness for Donald Trump in getting elected, because if you look back in US election history, first of all, with the midterms, normally the incumbent party that just won, which in this case will be the Republican Party, they do very poorly at the midterms. I think there's only 2 instances where the incumbent actually did better than before. So we would expect anyways for the Republicans to struggle to retain their majority in the House of Representatives, for example, in 2026. Add to that Donald Trump's record unpopularity in the United States. He's definitely not going to help the Republicans in terms of getting reelected with his current approval rating. And if you look at the recent elections that we had in the United States, a small number of them, there was a swing of over 10 points from the Republican candidate to the Democratic candidate on average. I think it was around 13 percentage points, which is huge. So all these are pretty bad portents for the Republican Party in 2026. And if we look back at the famous slogan from the campaign of Bill Clinton when he successfully became US president way back in the 90s, it was, "It's the economy, stupid." So the economy and how people feel they're getting on financially has a big impact, probably the most important impact normally in an election, whether it happens to be for the presidency or for Congress. And because of the cost of living crisis in the US, and since Trump took over, he's had this unorthodox policy of hitting a lot of countries with tariffs around the world. Curiously, not so many were put on Russia, but they put a lot on the European Union. They came to some agreement, and there's always the risk that he's going to put more tariffs on. The bottom line is that the US economy has weakened in the last year or so. Whether that's completely to do with the Trump administration or policies, or it's just part of the natural cycle, is unclear. However, politicians get punished at the ballot boxes in a democracy, which the US is. And the Trump administration could be severely handicapped going even into the midterm elections if many Republican members of Congress perceive that being close to Donald Trump and his administration would undermine their chances of being reelected. So we add in the threat of a massive sell-off of US Treasury bonds, that could make it very difficult for Donald Trump to take a very strident policy against and strategy against the interests of European countries, European Union countries, Ukraine, and United Kingdom. Because we've had last week Donald Trump's national security strategy, which put down in black and white a strategy for withdrawing pressure, maybe not economically on China, but definitely militarily on China and protecting Taiwan. And of course, it no longer sees Russia as an adversary. In fact, it advocated for a new Monroe Doctrine, so basically dominating the Western Hemisphere and undermining through political shenanigans the current parties in power in most of Western Europe and even parts of Central Europe as well. So definitely you see a strategy for election interference clearly outlined. That in conjunction with what Donald Trump and his administration have said and done since they came back into power. So we're looking at, say, the Munich Security Conference speech from J.D. Vance and the current negotiations that Donald Trump is orchestrating to basically force a mid to long-term capitulation of Ukraine and pushing it back into the Russian orbit. It's not a short-term capitulation, what he suggested. Ukraine would remain sovereign in the short term. That short term might turn out to be a few months if they were to sign it. So European countries are now looking at the United States no longer as a partner, not just because of something that Donald Trump woke up and has said that is, quite hostile to Europe. I mean, even when he gave this interview, it's about 2 days ago, to Dasha Burns of Politico. Again, he was scathing in his criticism of European countries and quite belittling of Ukraine and their chances of coming out successfully in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and of course of their President Volodymyr Zelensky. So European countries are looking at that. Not only is it what he says, it's also laid out in a strategy in conjunction with other members of his administration. However, because the United States is not a dictatorship, it is a liberal democracy that has regular elections and it has a separation of powers. So the president himself it's not like Russia, basically. It's not like Donald Trump is not Vladimir Putin. He can't just wake up and do what he wants, even though he has pushed the envelope quite a bit during this new presidency with respect to what he's able to do, and he seems to be testing that. We'll see what the U.S. Supreme Court says in due course on a lot of his actions that he's taken. Ultimately, he will be in a position that he could be undermined in terms of executing in that strategy to basically undermine European countries and their current governments and their security situation with respect to Article 5 of NATO, for example. In that strategy, it doesn't look like they would honor it if Russia were to attack, say, Latvia or Estonia. And of course, in the Russo-Ukrainian war, he's basically, at this point, leaning towards helping Russia win the war in the medium to long term. The Russians, on the other hand, just as a slight aside, are not interested in a mid to long term capitulation. They want a short term immediate capitulation of Ukraine. That's mainly for regime security. Vladimir Putin is fine with continuing the war because he feels like with the war continuing, he will stay in power. Of course, that might turn out to be a bad calculation with the state of the Russian economy as we go into 2026. And he does not want to take a risk of agreeing to this plan that Donald Trump has outlined, has been trying to cajole and bully the Ukrainians into accepting. That would lead to Ukraine almost certainly being overrun by Russia in the short to in the medium to long term and losing their political independence from Moscow. So what does this in grosso modo say about the current situation between European capitals and Washington? It suggests that they have finally realized that the Trump administration is actually a major threat to Europe's security, is no longer the guarantor. That might turn out to be very temporary. It may even lead to a change in the run-up to the midterm elections if many members of Congress don't feel that their chances of being reelected are furthered by going along what the Trump administration has outlined as a strategy. And we've seen a lot of blowback from many members of Congress. You got to also look at the opinion polls in America. Majority of not just Americans, not just Democratic voters, not just independents, but the majority of Republican voters support sending more assistance to Ukraine than the current Trump administration. And in fact, if you look at the list of issues, the approval rating for Donald Trump is the lowest with respect to his handling of the Russo-Ukrainian war. So it's definitely not a vote winner, although, again, this is the topic of today's video, that the economy is the most important aspect. It probably wouldn't be a game changer for the entire election, no matter what Donald Trump ends up doing with respect to Russia and Ukraine. However, this perceived weakness of the economic situation, which is making Donald Trump definitely less popular than he was back when he was elected in November 2024, is something that has been identified by a European intelligence service. Do I think that they will go and actually act and try to sell 2.34 trillion worth of US Treasury bonds? I think that's very unlikely. However, just raising the specter that they may do so is going to give them possibly some leverage with respect to Donald Trump. And you can see a hardening of the relations and the stance by many European capitals the leaders who feel like basically Donald Trump and his administration are plotting to overthrow might be a strong word, but definitely undermine their legitimacy and their prospects of retaining power in Ukraine, in addition to creating a massive security situation in Europe if the result is by the Trump administration is to try and throw Ukraine under the bus. And of course, with Article 5, the security guarantee from the US at least looking very weak and very shaky at the moment, then that also is something that gives them a lot of concern. So I'll leave it at that for today's video. I think it's a very interesting development. Who would have thought, if we look back a year, that European countries would be even considering, it being leaked to the media, that they would be even considering developing a strategy to weaken the US economic. I think the fallout from it would be, there'd be a lot of blowback for European countries as well. It's definitely not something that will be cost free, but the fact that this has even been leaked and the Overton window has moved so much to a more hostile stance between Europe and the United States is pretty dramatic. It's unprecedented in the last 80 years, and it will be interesting to see what happens. It could just be leverage also to stop Donald Trump maybe going even further in trying to maybe even assist Russia more openly in winning the Russo-Ukrainian war. At the moment, the US still does sell weapons to Ukraine via the European countries. Basically, they buy the weapons and then they give them to Ukraine, and they do provide intelligence to Ukraine. So the next step that we would see that this particular plan might come into play would be if the US were to cut off the weapons sales and stop sharing intelligence, and maybe even take a step further. That's what we mean by Overton window, that we got to consider these other very dramatic scenarios that could play out in the coming months. Personally, I don't think this will come to fruition. I don't think it will be necessary. I think already that the Trump administration is in a weak position within the Republican Party in terms of the midterms, but we have to see what happens in the next few months. I even saw some pro-Russian commentators kind of agreeing with me that probably by the late spring, what they would describe as Trump's usefulness to Russia would probably dramatically decline as he comes closer to being a lame duck president. Anyways, I'll leave it at that. Drop your comments down below what you think of this latest development. Of course, it is a leak into the media, so it has been done that presumably purposely by a European intelligence agency. So let me know what you think of the current state of the transatlantic relationship in light of this development, plus the national security strategy and the current negotiations between the US and Russia, US and Ukraine, and what has been happening in this region in general. So I'll say Slava Ukraini, Rom Slavim, do peremоги.